And what's the problem then with the Reserve Bank and central banks in general in this system?
Several. One is that they were created to rescue what are innately bankrupt institutions, for one. That's point one. Point two is that they finance what I call the welfare-warfare state, or in other contexts, the welfare state of credit, that among the privileges which they dispense is financing national governments. Among this process of creating loans, they become the financiers to governments. It's not a coincidence at all that the Federal Reserve System, whilst it was created in 1913, it rose to very great prominence in order to finance America's participation in the First World War. It's not at all a coincidence that the Bank of England began what today would be called open market operations in an aggressive fashion upon at the commencement of the First World War. It's not at all a coincidence that the monetary standard, the gold standard, government suspended it at the commencement of the First World War. Why? Because under all of those sorts of arrangements, governments can't fight wars. So the second criticism, combination of empirical and moral, is that the purpose of a central bank is to finance warfare. It's going to be very difficult to do so without that sort of a backstop.
But there's two kind of parts to your argument there. One is that the problem with the central bank is that it facilitates the fractional banking system. And secondly, that it's also financing governments, I think you're saying, beyond the system itself, to be able to do things which they could not afford to do, and that they maybe ought not to do.
Well, certainly,
like fighting wars, is that right?
Basically, yes. Such that today, when I say that the United States government is bankrupt, let me carefully say, what do I mean? That the net present value of its liabilities off balance sheet, but basically the promises which it has made with respect to Medicare, Social Security, according to a fellow Lawrence Kotlikoff at Boston University who studies these sorts of things, as of 30th of June, was on the order of $222 trillion. That's the net present value. That's in effect the reserves that need to exist in order to finance these promises going decades into the future. Those reserves simply don't exist. In other words, the promises aren't going to be kept. Recipients of Medicare aren't going to receive the benefits that politicians solemnly promised to them. Recipients of Social Security, the pension system there, are not going to receive the benefits which politicians solemnly promised to them. Now, are we going to wake up one day and find in big headlines in the New York Times or what have you, U.S. government goes belly up? No. It has begun, and when it began perhaps decades ago, a bankruptcy by stealth, whereby the queues, the waiting list for hip replacements and knee replacements become longer and longer. The purchasing power of Social Security becomes lower and lower. In other words, the people who depend utterly and completely upon the state, those who, alas, believe the politicians, are going to become poorer and poorer. The bankruptcy, the insolvency of the U.S. it has begun to take that form, and as time passes will become more and more apparent in that form.
Now, presumably one of the functions of the central bank in the conditions you described then is to solve this problem by creating more money, by printing more money. And is that not a reasonable solution to the problem? In other words, the institution is doing what it's designed to do?
The short answer is that's what it's trying to do, to paper over the cracks, but ultimately it's not money substitutes, funny money. Simply creating accounting balance sheet entries doesn't create a single additional house, it doesn't create another hospital, it doesn't create an additional tin of baked beans on the supermarket shelf. What it does do is give very privileged people, let's call them for the sake of argument investment bankers, merchant bankers, first access to those funds, which they then invest. If they spin the wheel, they make a profit on it. Who's last in the queue of the recipients would be people, alas, savers, pensioners and so on. The purchasing power of their currency has been eroded. There's some who do exceedingly well out of this system. There are others who lose massively. So part of the innate immorality of it is the fact that it basically stratifies society into the financial insiders. Mm-hmm. Heads they win, tails taxpayers and society as a general loses, and the outsiders who are barred remained outside, and their only role is much like troops in the First World War, to climb over the trenches and to be shot. They're cannon fodder for the generals who are well